Hello, I'm Andrei J, and today I'd like to talk to you about artificial life. Artificial life is a set of digital video oscillators I've made that fits in one little tiny unit. This is an open source design. You can build your own if you would like. And you can build it out of basically consumer grade objects. Or you could just buy one from me too, because I make these and sell them. They're the exact same format as a wave pool. If you have a wave pool or a spectral mesh already, you can download the image from my website, write it. Yeah, I don't think you burn to an SD card. You write things to an SD card, and then pop it in and try it out. I think it's a really great introduction to video oscillators and generative systems in general. I should probably write some of this out before I do this, but I don't know, who's got time to do anything but ad-lib. So I've been working on the manual for this for a bit. It's obnoxiously complicated. There's going to be crazy diagrams, and it'll explain all these things about generative systems and video oscillators that 90% of the people don't actually want to know. The thing is that playing with this is not that hard. Actually sitting down and figuring out the system and having fun with it, you can do it in just 15-20 minutes. If I just explain it to you while the video thing is going on, then it'll make 1,000 times more sense than reading the manual. I'll still finish the manual because I think it'll be interesting to folks, but I just kind of wanted to do this to give folks a hand, a hand up to get into the system. And so the control system is this Nano Control 2. I will make after I finish this video, I'm going to write up a little thing that'll just be a helpful little guide to which one of these knobs I'm talking about, and which one of these sliders, and which one of these buttons and everything. I'll describe the actual buttons and everything I'm doing and show you what's going on. It's at all confusing during this whole process. First off, so we have a video oscillator. Video oscillator has 3 arguments. It has rate, which is how much it changes from frame to frame. So this is a rate of 0, and this is as high as the rate goes. You can see that these oscillators don't go that fast. You can actually, they will go quite faster, but we'll get into that later. But this is, so I'm just going to start from this control. This is number 1 on the controller. And it's bipolar, so if you set it right in the middle, that's no movement. All the way to the left, movement in that direction, all the way to the right, movement in this direction. And then we also have frequency. Frequency is how many times per frame you have a cycle. So this is maximum, this is minimum. Frequency is unipolar, so it just goes from a frequency of basically one thing per frame to that many things per frame. Cycles. Frequency is right next to rate. That's number 2. And then the slider number 9 is amplitude. So amplitude refers to brightness, which is basically, pretty simple. More amp, more bright. Less amp, less bright. Something, if you've already played with artificial life before, something that is new, which I have just put on the updated version, which is if you've downloaded it in the last 24 hours, you're getting this version. So I've added color into it. So usually video oscillators are just grayscale, black and white to begin with, and then you add color based on the grayscale value afterwards. So what I have, if you look at knob number 7, you can basically dial in RGB offsets. So if I just play with knob 7, this is the R offset. If I hit the S button, which is below it and next to the slider right underneath it, next to that one, then that'll be green offset. And you can see it'll affect the brightness and the saturation as well a lot, because this is playing in pure RGB. I hit the M button, that's blue offset. And then I hit the R button, and that does basically a curve brightness remapping. It it does like an exponential. It turns the curve into more of like bloop, 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 kind of like squaring, cubing, and then quartering and quinticing. I think those are the right terms. Yeah, so that's how you get some color involved in this whole thing. Slider number 10, right next to amplitude. This slider has a bunch of different functions which all affect the radial sort of like orientation. So if I don't hit any of the buttons, it just sort of changes what the angle of this is. If I hit the S button, we add this sort of radial quality to it. So it'll start from the middle and sort of balloon outwards from there. And this is me changing the frequency in radial mode. If I hit the M button, you won't really notice it in this mode. Let me turn off the radial, and now I've got M on. So M adds a free running rotation. So basically, the higher M is, and this one's bipolar, the more it sort of rotates free running. And then I'm not going to talk about the R right now because R is where we start to involve other oscillators modulating this oscillator. And when I want to go through all the aspects of this oscillator and the other oscillator before we get into oscillator modulation, because that takes the complexity up a whole lot. Yeah, so on the amplitude slider, we've got a couple of buttons nearby. So ignore S for now. If I hit M, then we have a pulse wave, or a square wave, to be exact. And you notice this is a digital video synthesizer. There's going to be like digital crispy bits on the outsides of these angles. I'm a pretty big fan of this sort of stuff. If the digital nature of these things is going to turn you off, you're not going to have fun with this probably. And then if I hit R, that's a saw wave. Actually, I think it's a ramp wave. But if you only have one or the other, I think it's okay just to call it a saw and not a ramp. I don't know. I don't know how people feel about that usually. Yeah. So there's the wave shapes. So those are all of the qualities of this oscillator, which I call oscillator 0 in the manual, that you can affect that aren't being driven by another oscillator. If I hit this button off to the side that says cycle, you see we have another video oscillator, and this one's not doing anything. So this oscillator has the same set of controls as oscillator 1, they're just moved over 3 knobs. So you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 knobs over. We have rate control, 5 knobs over, frequency. Change the wave shape. Change the amplitude. Change the orientation, radialize, all the same things. And they're just kind of shifted over. And that's basically the minimum things you need to know about video oscillators to have fun with this. You can also dial in color with this. That'll be the slider. The slider, slider number 15, right underneath the other color slider. And you do that the same way. You just hit the buttons next to the side, and it changes from RGB offset and then the POW mapping. Yeah, so next up, let's go back to oscillator 1. I hit the cycle button again, and I'm back at oscillator 1. Now I want to, I didn't go over 1, 2, 3, knob number 3 and slider number 11 when I skipped, and you notice those weren't involved in oscillator 1. So the oscillator, or knob number 3 is ring modulation / amplitude modulation. It'll do slightly different things depending on what the amplitude of the oscillator is at. What this means, it'll take the brightness of oscillator 1 and apply it to oscillator 2. So you can see this is pretty easy to see what's going on. So there's oscillator 1, and there is ring modulating, or amplitude modulating, oscillator 0. right below that is phase modulation. So phase modulation takes the amplitude of oscillator 1, or the other oscillator, and uses it to offset the phase of the oscillator we're modulating. Not super noticeable right now. You can definitely notice it more. It adds this sort of like depth to everything, like an interesting perspective kind of zone when we do phase modulation and ring modulation at the same time. And then the buttons on the side of this change the total ranges for phase modulation and add some filters, which are going to come in handy when we start doing feedback phase modulation. So with M, now this is R. Just playing around with different values of phase modulation and ring modulation. If I go over to this oscillator 1 again, I'm going to turn off the radial zones on this. You might be able to see things a little more clearly, or just to see how it looks on the other oscillator. So you can see this is what phase modulation and ring modulation together are doing. So, signal-based feedback. What happens, so I'm going to turn off the phase modulation on this one, turn off the ring modulation. Let me go over to oscillator 1 and turn on the phase modulation. Notice right off the bat we're getting a little bit of some interesting like waves happening along the edges. That wasn't happening before, was it? Now it's happening. Here, I set ring mod to 0. Now we just have phase mod without feedback. Now let me turn up the phase mod in oscillator 0. We're looking at oscillator 1 right now. And now I've got both of the oscillators phase modding one another. So now we're getting this sort of, you can see that there's a feedback pattern happening. If I change the different ranges on the side, you get different kinds of patterns occurring. So now that we have, I can turn all of these things down a bit. Turn the frequencies up, and you can kind of see a bit more what's going on with the phase, the feedback phase modulation. And then just to isolate things, I'm going to hit the reset button. Hit the reset button. So I want to show you what ring modulation feedback looks like before we do more things together. We've got oscillator 1. In oscillator 1, I will... Oscillator 1 I'll make kind of red. Oscillator 2, I'm going to make this one blue and green. Or, yeah, make it those colors. There. So now we'll be able to sort of tell the difference as I swap between them, because they'll be opposing colors. Turn up some movement on both of these. Turn them. If you go all the way to the end, the knobs 8 and 16, these do rate mods where the rate argument of oscillator 0 and oscillator 1 sort of feedback on one another. So you'll get this sort of like, instead of just like constantly moving in the same way, you'll get this kind of movement. It'll change depending on how much you dial in each one of these, whether they're positive or negative, because both can be bipolar. But it's a nice way to sort of change up the feeling of the movement, so it's not just like click, 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 click kind of movement thing going on. But yeah, let's look at ring mod between these two. So here I'm dialing up ring mod positive a whole bunch on oscillator 1 and ring mod negative on oscillator 2. And you can see that it sort of clamps out and just like holds steady once it gets to like bright. Bright means RGB values have all sort of been like overdriven, like more than they like up to the max. There's a couple of buttons. So you see these buttons underneath the marker that say set, left arrow, right arrow. these buttons will do overflow things. So you can see, as I dial this one up enough, what we get is so that's with the button off, that's with the button on. What it's doing is, as soon as it gets to the maximum value where we'd be clamping on it white, it's going to hop on over, it's going to overflow. If I hit the arrow button next to it, that's going to fold it over, so it goes up to the top and then dips down and goes over, as opposed to the wraparound where it goes up and then starts from 0 and goes back up again. And then the last one of these, the right arrow to the right, does just some kind of pretty crazy, nasty distortion things with it. And that's with all of them off. And just like, so if I turn them both negative, then I find just like these sort of sweet spots, and they'll do this kind of stuff, which is pretty reminiscent of video feedback. We get reaction diffusion patterns happening and whatnot. If I do the POW mapping for each one, we can change the general like feeling and sort of tighten up in and out. POW mapping, the curve remapping kind of works as a filter in these cases. So you can see how that looks on either one of them. And you can see when you switch back and forth between the oscillators, when you have these like feedback structures, they will always sort of exist in a very similar way in both. Alright, so that covers sort of the basics of doing ring modulation and phase modulation feedback between these oscillators. So now I'm going to hit the reset switch. And then I would like to talk about using so there's secondary oscillators for each of oscillator 1 and oscillator 2, which are devoted just for modulating each one of those oscillators. So the way you access those oscillators is right next to slider number 9, there's this S button. And when you hit that S button, all of 1, 2, 3, and 9, 10, 11, the functions of those will be the same as they were for oscillator 1, but they'll be applied to the modulation oscillator. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to hit S, and I'm going to change the rate. You see it's not doing anything. I need to turn up the PM. So I'll turn up PM, which is pulse modulation, and now I turn up the rate and you see what's going on. And I'll turn on the ring modulation, change the frequency, turn on one of the overflow switches so we can see what's going on with the overflow a bit better. Let me add some color to this one. So I'll make this one sepia. No, let's make this one red again. Make this one pretty red. Then we'll be able to tell the difference if I switch to oscillator 2 at any point. Oscillator 2 I'll leave uncolored for the moment. So I've got ring mod and phase mod on. So far these switches don't do anything crazy different for the ring mod and the phase mod for these two, but I'll probably change that up for future ones. And then if I hit the S button again, and then I start oscillator 0 moving around, now we're starting to get some pretty exciting things happening. When doing this kind of modulation stuff, I really like to keep the frequencies low. You can really drive the frequencies, the frequencies up on both for pretty dense patterns. But if you have something you'll notice is that the frequencies are locked, then you'll get really repetitive movement. I go back over to oscillator, modulation oscillator, I hit that S button, and to turn off phase mod and ring mod. Ring mod is still on a little bit. So I'm on oscillator 0 right now. I'm going to go over to where the axis slider was and hit the R button. So what the R button does is it turns on the modulation oscillator to modulate oscillator 0 radially. It'll basically bend it in a radial pattern around. Did I say this was like easy to understand? I mean, when I say these words, I'm just like, okay, this is ridiculous. But if you just do it, you see what's going on, right? You take the frequency way down on each one of these oscillators, and then I'll turn up the modulation, the modulation oscillation. You kind of see what's going on a bit more, right? Slow it down. Go back over to hit the S button, so I'm back on the modulation oscillator, and change the wave shape. Maybe that'll help out a bit more. So now the modulation oscillator is a square wave, and shape the axis, and then you can turn on modulation oscillation on the modulation oscillator as well. So I get the R button next to the axis, and we get this crazy kind of nest pattern happening. Honestly, there's actually about maybe like 8 to 12 oscillators in this whole system. You just have like 4 sets of controls that control maybe about 8 oscillators in total. So that's how you can see when this happens. It's kind of a lot more going on than just 2 oscillators modulating one another. So there's a lot of like secret crazy signal flow things happening under the hood. Here I've turned up phase modulation and ring modulation a bunch. Getting pretty wild. So here's sort of what I'm talking about, you know, when I said this is like a good introduction to generative systems is right here we have like a very, so this is very chaotic in terms of it's completely deterministic, but very unpredictable. With just a handful of like movements we've gotten from like this to this. And everything I said about oscillator 0 also works on oscillator 1 as well. So here's oscillator 0. Go over to oscillator 1. Turn up the modulation oscillator. Let's see, let's make them both saw waves. The modulation oscillator, I'm going to do rotation modulation. Add some ring mod. Do some color offsetting. So yeah, it's just usually like you're only about 3 or 4 button and knob twists away from like any one of these kind of settings on this unit. And that's really kind of, that was my goal with this thing is, so I wanted to make a video oscillator, but something which was, I was always kind of a bit like, I didn't quite see the point or appeal of video oscillators for a long time. So I was just like, they're just kind of like static, they just do repetitive things. And it wasn't until I started playing around with like signal feedback in VSynth and Hydra until I was like, oh yeah, you can do some pretty amazing stuff with video oscillators. But a lot of this feedback oscillator things It's super, super easy to do in a digital mode, but it's a lot trickier to control and to finagle in an analog mode. So when I decided to make a video oscillator unit, I was like, well, it's going to be digital because that's what I do, and I should really just go all out and like try to like maximize the digital potential. So I was like, instead of just one oscillator, let's cram like, you know, theoretically 4, but a lot more oscillators in here. And instead of like going all out and trying to like emulate an analog rig, just go all out and try to make it as like digital as possible. Amplify like all the feedback things you can do. And yeah, it's sort of where I ended up with this. And I think it's a lot of fun. And I think people will really enjoy it once they maybe this video will help people sort of like get like a handle on like where they're going with this zone. Because the feedback I get is that this one's pretty confusing, and you know, can't really argue with that. I make some pretty confusing things, but they're at least like, you know, I like to think that I make things that are fun whether you understand them or not, and they only get more fun the more you understand them. And because they're so confusing, there's just so much more room for you to like grow and learn about what they do. Yeah, there's some pretty just like unbelievable patterns and structures you can get out of this thing. I think it's like very, well, one, it's the perfect thing to feed into Wavepool, because if you just want like sort of just like abstract sources to feed in, and you can control the gray, like the brightness values on this a lot, you can use this as like a pretty wonderful mask to feed into Wavepool, and just have some constantly changing, shifting movement to feed the video feedback off of. I've made a lot of videos I think you can see on my YouTube and on Instagram that sort of go into like the crazy sort of like alien landscape stuff you get out of these zones. Oh yeah, and there's one more kind of feedback you can do on this as well. So, let me hit the reset button. And if I go all the way over to slider number 16, I hit the M button. So you can do feedback. Actually, you can grab a camera input and use that. I'm changing, so I hit M button next to slider 16, and then I turn the knob above it, which is knob number 8. And that turns up the camera input for phase modulation. For oscillator 1. If I go over to oscillator 0, over to oscillator 1. and hit the slider next to it, I do the same thing. But each one of these, if you hit the double arrow buttons, each one of them on the far left underneath the cycle where you switch between the oscillators, you switch into doing, instead of grabbing the camera input to offset, you're grabbing the output of the oscillator itself. So this is doing internal feedback on the video oscillator. So this can do some pretty amazing stuff. I go into, do the PAL mod on it, do some filtering. And I'm doing some ring mod on it right now. Offset the colors a bit. And you can see I still have a bit of camera input coming in because I'm using oscillator 0. Oscillator 0 over here, I'm driving some ring mod off of it. So I can do both camera input modulation and internal feedback modulation within the same patch. Pretty wild. Yeah, so that's just some of the basics. For me to actually go through and like explain like all the different ways in which you could use this, I could probably do that for the rest of my life. But I think that's just the basic structure of kind of what you need to know. There's two basic oscillators that you draw, oscillator 0, oscillator 1. Each one of those oscillators has a sub-modulation oscillator. You hit the S button, the one that I'll write up in the little text accompaniment to this, switch functionality from the oscillators to the other oscillators, and everything kind of does everything else. And then you just sort of experiment with these like feedback modulations and play around with the color zones, and yeah, have a lot of fun. I don't know how helpful this was. This was, just like hearing the words out of my mouth, I'm just like, this is just absurdly complicated. But I think just seeing what's going on here will also be pretty amazingly beautiful. And yeah, I figured just having also video input. You can also, if you get the capture edition of this, you can send in your VHS tape to drive video oscillators, which is pretty nuts if you think about it. And I think I mentioned this earlier, but the thing about the difference between amp mod and ring mod is sort of like bipolar versus unipolar. So if you turn the amplitude of your oscillator off and turn ring mod all the way up, you're doing, instead of amp mod, you're doing ring mod. This is definitely something that's easier to draw out than to explain by mouth. Something I think if you ever play with Phosphorm has this sort of like amp mod, ring mod variable state thing going on. Yeah, I'm just getting lost in this specific zone right here. This is pretty great. Alright, here's a little bit of stimulus overload. Alright, I think that about wraps it up for this episode. We'll definitely do more of these in the future in terms of just like showing you very specific kind of patches I have in mind, but I think this is probably like a decent overview for everybody who wants to like know what the heck is up with artificial life. You can build it yourself, you can buy one from me, and you can download it and run it on your wave pool or spectral mesh already if you got one. Yeah, so I hope you all have fun. Let me know if there's anything else y'all need to know about this stuff in the comments. And thanks so much.